Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years studying why intelligent people make stupid decisions, never suspecting she was about to become her own best case study. The grant rejection letter felt heavier than it should have, though Elena couldn't quite articulate why. She'd been so confident. The methodology was flawless, the preliminary data compelling, the theoretical framework elegant in its simplicity. Yet here she sat in her Columbia office, staring at the polite but devastating words. While the committee recognizes Dr. Vasquez's considerable expertise, we found the proposed research lacks the innovative edge we seek for this funding cycle. Marcus Holbrook knocked on her door frame, his expression appropriately sympathetic. Rough news about the NSF grant? His voice carried that particular blend of concern and professional distance that Elena had come to appreciate over their 3 years as colleagues. Marcus understood the sting of academic rejection. He'd been passed over for the Templeton Fellowship just last month. "I can't figure out what went wrong," Elena admitted, gesturing to the letter. The proposal was solid. Hell, it was more than solid. Marcus stepped into her office, closing the door behind him, a gesture she'd grown accustomed to during their increasingly frequent conversations about departmental politics and research strategies. "Sometimes the most obvious answers are the hardest to see," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "You know that better than anyone, given your work on cognitive biases." She did know that. Elena's research focused on the systematic errors in human judgment, the predictable ways that even brilliant minds could be led astray. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was struggling to apply her own expertise to her current situation. "Maybe I'm too close to it," she mused, turning the rejection letter over in her hands. "Though I reviewed every section multiple times, had Sarah and David look it over. Did you consider that maybe the committee was influenced by factors beyond the proposal itself?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Academic politics can be complex." Elena frowned. She'd always prided herself on staying above the departmental fray, focusing on her research while others played political games. But Marcus's suggestion nagged at her, partly because it felt like an easy excuse, and partly because she'd been noticing subtle shifts in collegial dynamics that she couldn't quite parse. 3 days later, Elena stayed late to finish grading, the building eerily quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. She was gathering her papers when she heard voices from the conference room down the hall. Marcus's voice and that of Dr. Patricia Reeves, who chaired the university's internal review committee for major grant applications. "Brilliantly executed, really," Marcus was saying. "Elena's work on cognitive biases is sophisticated, but perhaps too narrow in scope for what NSF is looking for these days." When I spoke with them about the direction of bias research, they seemed more interested in applications that could scale beyond academic settings. Elena froze. When had Marcus spoken with NSF? And why was he discussing her research with Patricia? "Your proposal for the social psychology of decision-making in organizational contexts does seem more aligned with their current priorities," Patricia replied. Though I have to say, Elena seemed quite confident about her chances. "She's brilliant, don't get me wrong," Marcus said, and Elena could hear him shifting in his chair. "But she has a blind spot when it comes to reading the room, if you know what I mean. Very focused on the technical aspects, less attuned to the broader landscape. It's almost like she exhibits some of the cognitive biases she studies. Overconfidence, maybe. Confirmation bias in how she interpreted the committee's priorities." Elena's breath caught. The words hit her like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with such casual precision, such intimate knowledge of her psychological profile, and underneath the reasonable tone, she detected something else, a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. She found herself moving closer to the door, her rational mind screaming that she should leave, that she was violating a private conversation. But her research instincts had taken over. The same instincts that had made her career studying how people deceive themselves and others. "The timing of her sabbatical application is interesting too," Marcus continued. "Submitting it right after the grant rejection. It could be seen as someone running from failure rather than learning from it." Elena's world tilted. She hadn't submitted a sabbatical application. She'd mentioned the possibility to Marcus during one of their private conversations, a casual comment about maybe taking a semester to focus on writing if the grant didn't come through. But she'd never actually. The realization hit her like ice water. Marcus had been feeding information about her research directions, her timeline, her psychological profile, to people who could influence her career. And he'd been doing it under the guise of collegial support, even friendship. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. How long had this been happening? She thought about their conversations over the past months. How Marcus always seemed to know exactly what to say, how to position himself as the understanding colleague while subtly probing for information about her plans, her insecurities, her decision-making processes. Back in her office, Alina did what she always did when faced with a puzzle. She analyzed the data. But this time, the data was her own life, her own interactions, her own blind spots laid bare under the fluorescent lights. She pulled out her calendar, her email archives, her memory of conversations. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once, a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation so sophisticated that it had been invisible to someone who spent her career studying exactly these kinds of tactics. Marcus had identified her weakness, her pride in her analytical abilities. He'd consistently positioned himself as the one person who truly understood her intellectual approach, creating a false sense of alliance while gathering intelligence about her work, her timeline, her vulnerabilities. He'd used her own research against her, knowing that her confidence in her rational abilities would make her less likely to suspect emotional manipulation. The most elegant part, and Elena had to admire its psychological sophistication even as it sickened her, was how Marcus had leveraged her desire to be seen as objective and above departmental politics. By presenting himself as a fellow rational actor who shared her disdain for office politics, he'd created the perfect cover for his own political maneuvering. Elena sat in her office until nearly midnight, mapping out the full scope of what had happened. The grant rejection wasn't just bad luck. Marcus had positioned himself to influence the informal conversations that shaped formal decisions. The sabbatical rumor wasn't accidental miscommunication, it was strategic reputation management. Even her recent isolation from certain departmental discussions wasn't organic. It was the result of Marcus subtly redirecting conversations and meetings in ways that excluded her. She felt a strange combination of humiliation and fascination. She'd been studying decision-making biases for 15 years, and she'd fallen prey to several of them simultaneously. Overconfidence bias, assuming her expertise made her immune to manipulation. Confirmation bias, interpreting Marcus's behavior through the lens of collegial support rather than looking for alternative explanations. The fundamental attribution error, assuming that departmental dynamics were just natural friction, rather than considering that someone might be actively orchestrating them. But as she sat there, in the quiet of her office, surrounded by the evidence of her own psychological blind spots, Elena began to feel something else. A deep, clarifying excitement. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was data. It was the most intimate case study she'd ever had access to, and it was revealing something crucial about the intersection of intelligence and vulnerability. The next morning, Elena walked into the department with a new framework forming in her mind. She'd spent her career studying individual cognitive biases, but what she'd experienced was something more complex, a systematic exploitation of the metacognitive blind spots that come with expertise itself. She found Marcus in his office, preparing for his morning seminar. When she knocked, he looked up with that familiar expression of warm concern. "Elena, how are you feeling? You looked pretty shaken yesterday." "I'm fascinated, actually," she said, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being too close to see the obvious answers." Marcus smiled, that encouraging professor smile she'd grown to trust. "And?" "I realized you were absolutely right. I was exhibiting classic confirmation bias, interpreting the committee's priorities through the lens of what I wanted to believe rather than what the evidence actually suggested." "It happens to the best of us," Marcus said, his tone perfectly calibrated to sound supportive rather than condescending. "The thing is," Elena continued, I started wondering what other blind spots I might have. So I did what any good researcher would do. I analyzed the data, all of it. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. I found the most interesting pattern, Elena said, her voice taking on the tone she used when presenting research findings. A systematic campaign of information gathering and strategic positioning that was so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated to my psychological profile, that it was essentially invisible to me, until now. Marcus was very still. The beautiful thing, Elena continued, is that it worked exactly because I'm an expert in cognitive biases. You understood that my expertise would make me overconfident in my ability to detect manipulation, especially emotional manipulation. You knew that my intellectual pride would create a blind spot large enough to hide months of psychological maneuvering. Elena, I think you might be... Let me finish, she said, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus sit back in his chair. Because here's what I realized. You're not just manipulative, you're brilliant. The way you identified my specific vulnerabilities, the way you leveraged my desire to be seen as rational and above politics, it's actually a masterclass in applied psychology. Marcus's face had gone carefully neutral, the warm collegiality replaced by something colder and more calculating. But here's the thing, Elena said, leaning forward. I think you've made the same mistake I did. You've become so confident in your ability to read and manipulate people that you've developed your own blind spot. You assume that once you've identified someone's psychological profile, you can predict their behavior indefinitely. She stood up, moving toward the door. The problem with that assumption is that people can change. They can learn. They can develop new patterns of thinking, especially when they've been given such an intimate education in their own vulnerabilities. Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight. What exactly are you implying? Elena paused at the door, turning back to face him. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. You've just provided me with the most valuable research data I've ever collected. A complete case study in how expertise can create vulnerability and how that vulnerability can be systematically exploited. It's going to revolutionize how we think about the relationship between intelligence and judgment. She opened the door, then paused again. Oh, and Marcus? The next time you want to manipulate someone who studies cognitive biases for a living, you might want to consider that they might actually learn from the experience. As Elena walked back to her office, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of genuine discovery. Not just about Marcus's manipulation, but about the deeper paradox it revealed. Intelligence without emotional awareness didn't just create blind spots, it created the most dangerous blind spots of all, because they were hidden behind a facade of rational confidence. She had work to do. A new framework to develop, one that honored both analytical rigor and the messy reality of human psychology. One that recognized that true wisdom came not from perfect objectivity, which was impossible anyway, but from developing the metacognitive awareness to observe your own thinking patterns, especially when you felt most certain you were being rational. For the first time in months, Elena smiled as she sat down at her computer. She had a grant proposal to rewrite, and this time she knew exactly what story she wanted to tell.